Well, hello, my name's Louise Savage. Welcome to my channel, Louise Savage Muses. If you haven't been to see me, that doesn't sound right. If you haven't visited my channel before, a very warm welcome. And if you're not new to my channel, thank you very much for returning. And before I go any further, I just want to say the book community is just a community that keeps on giving. I received so many really kind, lovely, wonderful messages. It's really uplifting. So thank you very much for that. I really do appreciate it. So it's autumn, isn't it? We're just certainly in the UK. The trees are on the turn. The weather's doing strange things. There was an extraordinary mist in my garden, or fog in my garden yesterday. I'm never quite sure the difference between mist and fog. And you know, I looked outside at about 7 o'clock in the morning. You could just see the thinnest strip of grass underneath the mist, and I thought, oh, here we go. But the air's still really warm, and the house martins and things don't seem to be migrating yet, so maybe we've got a bit more summer in us. But anyway, I did right at the end of August read a memoir, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. And it just got me thinking that I think very often at this time of year, I don't know why, autumn seems for me to be a season of reflection. And so that's why I thought it'd be quite nice to have a chat about some of the memoirs that I've read and enjoyed. And I actually realised there are quite a few, so I'm going to do this in 2 stages, I think. Otherwise you'll get some rambling, really long video that will send you to sleep. Which, you know, might be what you want, so that's fine. Anyway, so first up this is the book that I read towards the end of August, and it's called The Erratics, and it's by can never remember her surname, Vicki Laveau-Harvie, and this book is set in Canada, which is where Vicki grew up. Well, I say set in, it is set in, but you know, I suppose is a memoir set somewhere? Well, yeah, I suppose it is, isn't it? I always think that setting is kind of a created construct, but of course it isn't in this case. So Vicki grew up in Canada and now lives in Australia. And the reason I think that she lives in Australia is to get as far away as she possibly can from her mother. She had a really quite traumatic childhood, as you learn as you're reading this, and her sister still lives in Canada. She lives in Vancouver with her female partner, who I'll come back to in a moment. But the memoir starts with Vicki's mother being admitted to hospital, and so Vicki, as any dutiful daughter would, travels from Australia to Canada. She's dreading it, and when she gets there she finds what she'd already suspected, that her father has basically been made a prisoner. He's very old, he he's not very independent, and her mother has practically starved him, so she's very concerned about the safety of her father, but equally does not want to spend time with her mother. And her mother is really manipulative. She has been throughout Vicki's life. She manipulates everybody around her, including her father. In fact, the father is quite confused towards the beginning of the memoir, and at one point Vicki turns up and he says, "Which one are you?" because he can't tell which of his 2 daughters it is standing in front of him. So the memoir really focuses on a kind of battle to make the most of this hospitalisation of her mother so that her father can actually recover. But there are lots and lots of flashbacks to Vicki's childhood. And you know, there are huge sections of her childhood that she just can't remember because presumably they were so horrendous. So I found it, you know, I've read many memoirs, and lots of memoirs about, you know, growing up, obviously, so understandably a very common theme. But this one, it could be a misery memoir, but it just isn't. there's I really like the way she writes. It's quite poetic in places. In fact, the title, The Erratics, she explains the Erratics were lots of rocks that were formed from an ice sheet millions of years ago, and they're kind of scattered across the territory around Alberta, which is where her parents live. So it seems like a really well chosen title, because kind of, you know, her parents are erratic. She has this erratic kind of backward and forward between Australia and Canada. So I really enjoyed that. I enjoy the way it's written, and I enjoy the way that it's not full of any sort of detailed descriptions of any sort of trauma or anything like that. It's much more reflective, much more thoughtful, and I really really enjoyed that aspect. And I also loved the sort of tension that exists between her and her sister, largely generated by Vicky's own guilt for not being closer. It's really hard, isn't it? And one of the things I really loved about this book was, I keep saying that, sorry, sounds like a stuck record. But one of the things I loved about it was the generosity of her sister's partner. You know, she's very willing to kind of step in. She'll sometimes defend Vicky against her sister on occasion. You know, and I found that very gratifying as well. So, yeah, really interesting book. And because it's, you know, you can see the landscape's quite snowy, it's cold. Maybe quite a nice thing to read over the autumn or winter months. And then I thought about the first memoir that I think I read, because I haven't really got into non-fiction until the last sort of probably 7 or 8 years. And so I read Bad Blood by Lorna Sage. It was recommended to me by a lovely colleague at work called Barbara. And I think one of the reasons she thought I would enjoy it is because Lorna Sage grew up in North Shropshire, which is, you know, the county that I live in and very much love. So from a historical perspective, because she's kind of the most of the memoir focuses on the 1940s and 1950s. So it's really interesting to sort of read about rural life. And in many ways, this is a kind of memoir to life in those times, as just as much as it is to Lorna's own upbringing. Now, she had a really quite eccentric childhood experience in that father was away in the army, and so she lived with her grandfather and grandmother, who hated each other. I mean, her granny hates her granddad so much that he actually has a scar on his cheek where she attacked him with a carving knife, apparently. And, you know, a lot of the friction revolves around the fact that granddad is a womanizer, he's a drinker, but he also happens to be a vicar. So they're rattling around in this vicarage, and it's very much as if he's kind of been exiled to the countryside because he's not really appropriate personality to do the job he does. So that's fascinating. And also, you know, the way that Lorna views him as a child looking up to him is interesting as well. And quite, you know, funny, amusing at times. When her father returns from the army, they then move into a newly built council house, which is kind of going up in the world. They've got their own space. And so, you know, again, it explores that aspect of life at the time. And her parents' marriage is equally damaged, really. Because her father's an absolute workaholic, and you know, that sort of dominates his existence. And then to cap it all, Lorna herself becomes gets pregnant at a very young age. So and again, it's stunningly written. Lorna Sage is actually a literary critic, so you know, she knows an awful lot about the subject of writing. And I always feel for people like that when they embark on their own first published piece of work, because it must be you must have to brace yourself, I suppose, for any criticism that might wing your way. But she does an absolutely astonishing job of it. So there we are. Bad Blood by Lorna Sage. highly recommend. And then this memoir by Jeremy Bowen, it's called War Stories. Now, if you don't know Jeremy Bowen, he is a war reporter, and he has also been the BBC's foreign correspondent, those kinds of roles, very prominent in the UK, an extremely knowledgeable man. You know, whenever if there's a crisis in any part of the world that he, you know, goes to report on, he's one of those people who can explain an incredibly complex political situation very, very simply. And I've always admired him. I think maybe I've got a little bit of a thing about him, I don't know. He's a similar age. Yeah, he just fascinates me. And I think I've also always been really, really interested in why would anyone want to make a living out of going to report on wars and being in a war zone. To me, it seems like a really extreme way of earning a living. And in many ways, this is what this book, as Bowen says, that's the question that this book is trying to address. And it revolves around the fact that when he had his first child, he realised that he was addicted to his job, that it actually was an addiction, and he couldn't he wanted to sort of try to settle down and spend more time with his family, but he was experiencing withdrawal. So anyway, so he writes this account, and it takes you to, I mean, he was in Afghanistan, he was there for the first Gulf War, Kosovo, where else? Anything in the sort of Middle East really, and Jerusalem, that kind of thing. Baghdad, he's been there, he's reported on it. Some of my favourite moments in here were accounts of him in Kosovo. Very, very compelling. But yeah, just somebody I really admire, and again, he writes so apparently honestly. I mean, I say apparently because, of course, you know, whenever anyone's writing a memoir, they're giving a version of themselves, aren't they? And we have to kind of, you know, read it with that knowledge. But I think he does a corking job. I love it. And then another autobiographical piece of writing, because I'm never quite sure what a memoir is really. I mean, it's autobiography, isn't it? I suppose quite often it just focuses on a particular phase of somebody's life, but I don't really understand the distinction, because when you write an autobiography, you're being reflective, aren't you? Anyway, there we are. So this is Chris Hadfield's book, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. And there's a lovely story, to my mind, behind why I read this book in the first place. So I was teaching year 7, that's 11-year-olds in the UK. And I was teaching a group of children who really struggle to read, really struggle to write. And we were doing about space poetry and aliens and all that kind of thing. And this little lad said, "Oh, my mum's reading a book about space. Would you like me to show it to us?" Yeah, bring it into school. So he brought this book in. And I would never have encountered this book, I don't think, if it hadn't been for that child. And I opened it. Now his mum had a much posher version. It was hardback and it had beautiful colour illustrations in it. But I opened it and I started to read the first page. I mean, the picture, look at the photograph. You know, he really sort of captures the fascination of space. And I am pretty certain that I will never go into space. I can't see that ever happening. But I just read the first sentence. I don't know what I've done with my reading goggles. Here we go. This is how he describes it. He starts off, introduction, Mission Impossible. Okay, great title for a chapter. The windows of a spaceship casually frame miracles. And I was like, wow, this is an astronaut and he's writing poetry. And then he describes, you know, the Earth from space. And and just the way he describes it is absolutely beautiful. And then the next minute he's describing his first spacewalk, and I can never remember which way round it is, and that just shows how spatially unaware I am, like literally spatially, because so you go off into this wonderful poetic world and you're envisaging the Earth from space, and then suddenly there's this hilarious paragraph where he's writing about how I think he's in a square space suit and he's got to get out a round hole to do his first spacewalk, and he's done all these months and years of training, and yet nobody's told him how to actually open the hatch and physically get out. And I just adore this chap. I mean, he defeated all the odds to become an astronaut. So he grew up in Canada. Well, Canada did not have a space program, and when he was, I think, about 6 or 7, and also he grew on a farm in the middle of nowhere. And when he was about 6 or 7, he decided that he wanted to become an astronaut, and the chances of that are so remote. It's just ridiculous. So he kind of went for the second best thing, became a pilot first, but eventually ended up doing exactly that, and flew very often. Well, did fly. Do you fly into space? Can't even think. But he went into space with the Russian space program, the Soyuz craft, I want to say, and his descriptions of, you know, things like what it's like because the Russians, they don't land in the sea when they come back, they land on land and kind of bounce across the desert. And so his descriptions of landing and of what it's like to come out of a spaceship when you've been in zero gravity for so long, and his sort of descriptions of everyday life are, well, having read this, I almost feel like I've been there myself. And to me, that's what this type of writing is trying to achieve. You know, it's that whole idea of sharing an experience with the reader. And I completely felt that he had gone overboard. And the writing isn't overboard. The writing's really, like I say, carefully crafted and clever. And, you know, you're not reading it really conscious that he's writing something either. So yeah, I really admired this book, and I would recommend it to anyone. And I think, you know, it's the sort of thing that young adults should read, because it kind of shows that with you know the right kind of attitude, you can certainly really try hard to achieve your goals. And there's one chapter in it with the most hilarious story I think I've ever read. I was crying with laughter. I can't tell you anything about it. It just involves him being in a plane, because it would completely spoil it. But yeah, no, I really, really enjoyed this. So that's the 4 memoirs that I've chosen to rattle on about today. I hope you may well have read some of them, and I love it when you comment on, you know, your readings of the things that I talk about, and whether you love them or hate them and why, and you know, it's really interesting. And yeah, I hope that was useful, and I will be back shortly with another 4. Okay, take care everybody. Bye.